This is the Deseret News National Edition, when your family needs to know more.
Good morning, I'm Dave McCann. On this Easter holiday, we begin with a closer look at religious freedom. Elder Dallin H. Oaks of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles delivered the keynote address at Utah Valley University's Spring Constitutional Symposium in Orem. Before his talk, he told us he was not speaking as an LDS church leader, but as a concerned, knowledgeable citizen. Elder Oaks served as a judge for Utah's Supreme Court and also taught law at the University of Chicago. Here's his interview now with KSL News Radio's Amanda Dixon and Grant Nielsen.
You say religious freedom is at stake, and I think it would be helpful if you could illustrate how critical that situation is at this point.
Well, there are many contests about religious freedom in our country today. We've always had such contests, at least for a century, but now they've gotten to be very political and very divisive. And specifically, we've got non-discrimination, which is a very important civic value, being set in opposition to religious freedom. And people are choosing up sides as if you couldn't have both of them. And it's not a good situation. And related to it is the fact that some of the contests are really impinging on free speech, something the media ought to be concerned about, as well as citizens generally.
So would you say then, Elder, is the First Amendment doing its job to protect religious freedoms in America?
Well, the First Amendment stands as a barrier, but it's constantly in interpretation. And some of the current interpretations of freedom of religion, for example, put that value in doubt. For example, I'm very concerned about an argument that's being made by some scholars that religious freedom doesn't really add anything to free speech, that as long as ministers are able to speak and as long as people are free to worship, all of that comes under free speech, and there's no reason to be concerned about the free exercise of religion. I'm quoting the constitutional provision. That's a very dangerous argument. The framers of our Constitution must have felt that there was something very significant in the freedom of religion because they provided two guarantees for the freedom of religion. They guaranteed the free exercise of religion, and they also guaranteed free speech. And both of those great values, the first freedoms we call them, combine to protect the freedom of religion. And that is being threatened by arguments that are being put forward and sometimes relied on impliedly or directly by courts.
You said a short time ago when you spoke at BYU, Idaho, that we should contend for the free exercise of religion. How do you see that happening?
Well, there are a number of different things that people can do to contend for it. One is to insist upon their right to be heard in the public square. There's another theory abroad in the land, and it's relied on expressly by some judges and by some scholars, that religious values are off limits in the public square, and that they certainly can't be used by lawmakers, which is a preposterous argument. Anyone who knows anything about Anglo-American law knows that the law of crimes and the law of family and a lot of other laws are based on the Judeo-Christian heritage. You can take them right back into the Old Testament. And to say that religious values are not an appropriate basis to make laws, or in other words, to say that this is wrong and therefore we'll make it illegal, that's a preposterous argument, but it's gaining velocity today, and that's one of the reasons for concern. People are saying in public debates, and some legal philosophers are publishing books and contending that a person has to have a public reason for making a law or making an argument. And a public reason can't be religious faith or religious values.
We think in terms of people of faith when we think of religious freedoms, and the discussion seems to be centered in that arena. Elder, if you could comment on how society benefits generally people who might not be considered people of faith. How do they benefit from our religious freedoms being protected and preserved?
Well, it's a good question, Grant. Let me just call upon an answer in these terms. We know that we cannot have a civilized society by depending upon laws and law enforcement to regulate the conduct of citizens. The amount of conduct of citizens in any respect, whether it is obeying laws or not obeying laws, simply obeying ethical conduct or consideration of neighbor and so on, the amount of that can be the subject of laws or that can be enforced by laws is a tiny fraction. The civilized society is held in place by obedience to the unenforceable. And it's religion that teaches people to obey the unenforceable.
When you say that all people of faith should be encouraged to walk shoulder to shoulder on the same path to religious freedom, a noble idea, but what about people of faith who might be frustrated by laws or municipalities who have done things like eliminating nativity scenes on public land, or not allowing religious groups to meet in schools or something like that, and they're tempted to throw their arms up and say, well, what can I do? How do you respond to that?
Well, this goes back to a question that you asked earlier, and I gave an incomplete answer. One thing that people of religious faith can do is bring a lawsuit to enforce the free exercise of religion. Now, one thing that is notable in our law today, which I know as a former judge and a longtime law professor and practitioner of law, is that the law of free speech has been very well developed. There are thousands of cases testing the limits of free speech. There are very few cases testing religious freedom and the free exercise of religion.
Why?
Why? Because people interested in free speech, for one reason or another, which I can't explain entirely, they've been very likely to bring lawsuits. And there are a lot of free speech lawsuits, but there are plaintiffs behind them. Courts make law and define the law under the First Amendment when a plaintiff brings a lawsuit. And there have been many times more plaintiffs on free speech than there have on religious freedom. So the law is not well developed. And I would say to people who are interested in the free exercise of religion, get a lawyer and go to court and develop the law.
You think ground could be gained there?
Oh, yes.
Elder Oaks, thank you so much for your time. It's been just an honor to be with you today. Thank you.
Pleasure to be with you.
The 10 Today series has been examining the 10 Commandments in modern society. And it seems social media is making it harder not to covet. National editor Allison Pond explains how the psychology of envy drives consumerism.
Instagram envy. It's that little pang you feel when your friend posts pictures of her swanky vacation or an actress posts pictures of her fancy new heels. Research shows that ideals of the perfect life may be shifting. We can be inspired by seeing what our peers are doing on social media, but we can also become hyper aware of their own accomplishments and compare ourselves to them. Part of the allure of Instagram and other social media sites is that it purports to represent someone's real life. But you have to ask yourself whether what's shown in those photos is really a representation of what their life is actually like.
We'll explore a couple more commandments later in the show. Up next, we're making gefilte fish. See why this Jewish dish has come to celebrate friendship and faith for these women when National Edition continues.